The year was 1920, and the small town of Ashford, Arkansas, moved at the rhythm of church bells and train whistles. Cotton fields stretched endlessly, and the river that cut along the edge of town carried both life and secrets in its slow current. Life here was plain to outsiders, a patchwork of farms and dirt roads, but underneath the quiet, there was always a hum of unease. People knew their neighbors, but not always as well as they thought. Smiles at Sunday service could hide grudges, and the men who stood on the porches of the general store knew how to keep their stories tucked away, especially the ones that should never see the light. That on one corner of town stood a tall, weathered house, its windows always half-shuttered, its paint peeling from too many summers in the sun. The Coones family had lived there for as long as anyone could remember. They were neither wealthy nor poor. Ezra Coones, the head of the family, was known for being hardworking, stubborn, and a man who didn't take kindly to being questioned. He carried himself with the weight of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. Some in town said his eyes lingered too long on people, that his silence wasn't the kind that brought peace, but the kind that made you uneasy. Ezra's wife was quieter still. She kept to herself, tending to the home and their children with a devotion that appeared to be love from the outside, but might have been fear beneath the surface. No one asked too many questions. In those days, questions were dangerous. The church taught that families were sacred, and what happened behind closed doors was not for others to judge. But whispers found their way into kitchens and back porches. People noticed bruises hidden under sleeves, the way her voice sometimes broke when she greeted others. Their children grew up in the shadow of their father's moods. Some days he was steady, working long hours in the fields or fixing tools with precise care. Other days, his temper would strike without warning, leaving a trail of broken things and silence heavier than any shouting could be. The children learned early to read his steps, the drag of his boots across the floor, the tightening of his jaw when something displeased him. They lived in a constant state of waiting, never sure which version of their father would come home at night. To the rest of Ashford, this was just another family. Every house had its struggles, every marriage had its scars. But in Ezra's home, those scars were deeper, darker, and more dangerous than anyone dared to speak about. He was a man who believed in control above all else. Control over his land, his family, his reputation. And control, when clung to too tightly, becomes its own kind of poison. The town itself was fragile in its own way. 1920 had brought changes that not everyone welcomed. Prohibition was the law now, but liquor still flowed in secret. The war had ended only 2 years earlier, and young men came back different, carrying memories that didn't fit with the quiet rhythms of farming life. People tried to return to normal, but there was no real normal anymore. There were cracks everywhere, cracks in marriages, in friendships, in the faith people clung to so desperately. And in those cracks, men like Ezra thrived. The kind who knew how to bend rules without being caught. The kind who understood that fear could be as strong as love when it came to keeping people close out on the surface. The Coones family looked steady. The children attended school, their mother shopped at the market, and Ezra worked the land with the same stubborn resolve his father had before him. But if you watched closely, you'd notice how the children never lingered after school, how their mother rarely made eye contact, how Ezra's name carried more weight in a room than it should. It was as if everyone knew something was wrong, but no one dared to say it aloud. Late summer carried with it a heat that pressed down on the town like a warning. Cicadas screamed in the trees. The nights grew restless, and tempers flared faster than usual. The Coones' home seemed especially tense then. Neighbors recalled seeing Ezra out late, standing on his porch with a cigarette glowing in the dark, his figure rigid as if holding something back. His wife was seen less and less, her absence explained away with quiet excuses. The children's laughter, once heard faintly from the yard, had grown rare. Something was building in that house, something no one could quite name. You could sense it in the way people lowered their voices when they mentioned Ezra, in the way the pastor's prayers for troubled households seemed aimed in his direction. What began as a life that looked ordinary from the outside was slowly twisting into something else, something far more dangerous. And then, As it always does in stories like this, the quiet world that everyone thought they understood began to crack open. The choices made behind those shuttered windows, the secrets whispered into the dark, and the anger that had been held back for too long would soon spill out into the town, leaving a stain no one could wash away. The summer of 1920 stretched on like a fever that wouldn't break. The fields were heavy with cotton, but the rains had been scarce, and every farmer in Ashford felt the strain. Money was tight, tempers were shorter, and even the laughter in town seemed thinner than before. For the Coones family, the pressure sank deeper into their bones. The house that already carried so much silence now seemed to echo with it. Every sound, footsteps across the wooden floor, a door creaking in the night, a chair scraping against the kitchen table, felt sharper, like the whole place was waiting for something to snap. Ezra's temper began showing more often. He had always been stern, but now it was as if every small thing carried the weight of an insult. A missed chore, a late meal, the children speaking too loudly, it could all ignite him. His wife learned to move carefully, to keep her eyes low and her words measured. But even her silence sometimes angered him. The children, old enough to sense danger, but too young to fight it, grew restless in their fear. They whispered to each other in the dark, their small voices carrying the questions no one dared ask aloud. Neighbors began noticing more. A cracked window that looked like it had been broken from the inside. The eldest boy was walking to town with a bruise he couldn't explain. The way Ezra's wife flinched when someone spoke to her too suddenly. But in Ashford, people turned away from what they couldn't fix. That's a man's house, they would say, not our place. And so the Coones home remained closed off, a place people watched but never entered. Ezra himself felt the strain of more than just family. The cotton market wasn't what it had been, and he was losing ground to men who had newer tools, bigger plots, better luck. Pride was everything to him, and he would not let anyone see weakness. That meant working longer hours, pushing harder, and letting the frustration bleed into every part of his life. He drank, though liquor was supposed to be scarce under Prohibition. But Ezra had his ways. Everyone suspected he was tied to the men who ran bootleg whiskey along the river, and though no one dared accuse him directly, his nights away from home only fueled more whispers. His wife's isolation grew worse. There were days she did not leave the house at all. On the few times she was seen in town, her face looked pale, her smile tight as if held in place by force. She would speak of ordinary things, flour, soap, the children's shulin. Gee, but her eyes betrayed something else. Some women noticed and tried to offer kindness in subtle ways, but Ezra's shadow seemed to follow her even into town. If someone spoke too long to her, Ezra would be there the next time, standing behind her, his hand heavy on her shoulder, his stare daring anyone to interfere. The children carried the heaviest burden of all. They lived with two versions of their father. The one who worked silently in the fields, his back bent under the sun, and the one who stormed through the house at night, his voice sharp enough to cut through walls. They never knew which man they would face. The eldest son began to take on more responsibility, trying to shield the younger ones, but it was more than a boy his age should carry. At times, he would stand a little taller, his jaw set in a way that mirrored his father's. It was as though the cycle was already threatening to repeat itself. One night, after too much whiskey, Ezra accused his wife of betrayal. He said she had been speaking with another man in town, that her glances were too long, her errands stretched too far. She denied it, but denial only fed his rage. That night, the shouting shook the walls. The children huddled in their room, their little bodies pressed close together, listening to the thuds of furniture being overturned, the crack of a hand across skin. By morning, their mother's face was swollen, her eyes hollow. She said nothing to the children, only told them to eat quickly and go to school. The silence was worse than the noise that Ezra's paranoia deepened. It wasn't just his wife he distrusted. He grew suspicious of neighbors, convinced they were speaking behind his back, waiting for him to stumble. He questioned his children about who they spoke to, where they walked, what they saw. He kept tighter control, closing the family off from anyone who might try to reach them. What age? had once been a tense home became a locked cage. At the same time, outside forces pressed harder. The sheriff in town, a man who had known Ezra since childhood, began hinting at debts owed. Some said Ezra was behind on land payments. Others claimed he had been caught dealing with bootleggers. Whatever the truth, he carried himself with the desperation of a man cornered. That desperation seeped into everything. It was in his sharp words, in his heavy drinking, in the way he looked at his family as though they were both his property and his burden. And then came the incident that no one in town forgot. At a Sunday service, the Coones family sat in their usual pew, quiet and watchful. The sermon was about forgiveness, but Ezra seemed restless, shifting in his seat, his jaw tight. When the service ended, his wife lingered behind for a moment, speaking to another woman about the children's schooling. Ezra waited at the door, his eyes fixed on her, and when she finally stepped out, he gripped her arm so tightly that people nearby winced. He said nothing, only pulled her along with such force that her feet stumbled. The silence of the congregation that day was deafening. Everyone saw, everyone understood, but no one spoke. That public display changed things. People began to fear Ezra differently, not just as a man with a temper, but as someone who carried his violence openly, unashamed. It was no longer hidden behind doors. It was there for all to see, daring anyone to stop him. That fear kept everyone quiet, but it also planted seeds of unease. How far could he go if unchecked inside the home? The tension built like a storm that refused to break. His wife grew more distant, her voice softer, her movements slower. The children watched everything, storing each moment in their small hearts, their innocence eroding with each passing day. Ezra, meanwhile, grew more consumed by his own demons, his pride, his jealousy, his need for control. He believed his family owed him loyalty at any cost, that their fear was proof of his strength. But control is fragile. The more he tightened his grip, the more it threatened to slip through his fingers. The house felt like a tinderbox, waiting for the smallest spark. The town, though outwardly calm, seemed to hold its breath. Something was coming, something inevitable, something terrible. The breaking point was near, though no one yet knew it. Every bruise, every harsh word, every night of drinking and rage had been stacking like kindling. And when the fire came, it would consume not only the Coones family, but the quiet town that had chosen silence over intervention. The night it happened, the air was heavy with the kind of heat that made sleep impossible. The cicadas screamed louder than usual, their steady rhythm cutting into the silence of the house. Ezra had been drinking for hours, his footsteps uneven across the wooden floors, his muttering drifting through the rooms like smoke. The children huddled together in their small bedroom, wide-eyed, listening to the creak of the boards under his weight. They had grown used to these nights, but this one felt different. The tension carried something sharper, something final. In the kitchen, a single oil lamp cast shadows that flickered across the walls. Ezra's wife moved carefully, her hands trembling as she cleared the table. She tried to keep her head down, tried to keep the peace, but nothing worked anymore. Ezra's suspicion had grown into an obsession. He accused her of lies, of betrayal, of shaming him in front of the town. Each word cut deeper than the last, his voice rising and falling like waves crashing against rock. She said little, but her silence was like kindling to his rage. He slammed his fist against the table, the sound echoing through the house. The children flinched in their room. His wife's heart pounded so loud she could hear it in her ears. He stood, towering over her, his face red from drink and anger. His words were slurred but sharp, accusing her of sins she never committed. When she finally spoke, her voice broke in the middle, pleading for him to stop, to think of the children. That plea was the spark. His hand struck her face with such force she stumbled into the corner, the lamp wobbling dangerously on the table. Her breath caught in her throat, but something inside her shifted. After years of silence, years of swallowing fear, something broke free. She told him he was wrong, told him he had ruined everything, told him she wasn't afraid anymore. Her words were trembling, but they carried a strength that startled even her. Ezra froze for a moment, stunned. No one ever spoke to him like that. His children never dared. His neighbors never dared. His wife had never dared. And in that moment of defiance, his pride, already brittle, shattered, he grabbed her by the arm, his grip iron, and pulled her into the kitchen, the lamp rocking until it crashed to the floor, spilling oil and smoke into the room. The smell of burning filled the air, mingling with the sharp tang of sweat and whiskey. She struggled, pulling against him, her breath coming fast, her eyes wild with both fear and fury. For the first time, she fought back. Her nails scratched his arm, leaving thin red lines. She screamed, a sound the children had never heard from her before. Raw, piercing, desperate. The children burst from their room, drawn by the chaos. They stood frozen in the hallway, eyes wide, watching their father and mother locked in a struggle that felt larger than life. Ezra's rage only deepened at the sight of them. To him, their presence was weakness exposed, control slipping through his hands. He roared at them to go back, but they didn't move. Their silence was another defiance, and it fed the storm inside him. In the blur of motion that followed, the kitchen became a battlefield. Ezra's wife grabbed the iron skillet from the stove, swinging it in trembling hands. It connected with his shoulder, the thud reverberating through the room. He staggered, more from shock than pain, and for a moment his eyes looked less like fury and more like disbelief. The children gasped, their breaths quick and shallow, but disbelief turned to rage in an instant. He lunged at her, his hands closing around her throat. The strength in his grip was merciless, born from years of control and fueled by alcohol and wounded pride. She clawed at his hands, her nails drawing blood, her body thrashing against him. Her eyes met his in those final moments, filled with both terror and defiance. She tried to speak, but no words came. Only the sound of air struggling to escape her lungs. The children screamed. The eldest, shaking but determined, grabbed at his father's arm, trying to pull him away. Ezra shoved him back with such force that he hit the wall and crumpled to the floor. The younger ones cried out, their voices a chorus of fear and helplessness. The struggle ended as suddenly as it began. Her body went limp in his arms, her eyes fixed on nothing. The room fell into a silence that was louder than any scream. Ezra's chest heaved, his face slick with sweat, his hands trembling as he let her fall to the floor. The fire from the spilled lamp sputtered out on its own, leaving only smoke curling through the air. For a moment, Ezra just stood there, staring down at her. His rage had drained, leaving behind something hollow. His breath came ragged, his eyes glassy. He looked less like a man and more like a shadow, emptied out by what he had done. The children stood frozen, their young faces twisted with horror, their sobs breaking the silence in uneven bursts. Then came the panic. Ezra muttered to himself, "Pa, sing the room," his hands running through his hair. "It wasn't supposed to," he whispered, his words slurred. "She made me." She pushed. The justifications spilled out, thin and desperate, as if saying them aloud would make them true. He kicked the broken lamp aside, his boots crushing shards of glass. His mind racing with half-formed plans, he turned to the children, his eyes wild. They shrank back, pressed against the wall. He told them not to speak, not to say a word, that no one would believe them anyway. His voice cracked between command and plea, as though he wasn't sure himself. The eldest boy stared at him with a mixture of hate and fear, his small fists clenched tight. The younger ones clung to each other, their cries muffled against each other's shoulders. Ezra dragged his wife's body across the kitchen floor, leaving behind faint streaks of blood and oil. The sound of her heels scraping against the wood echoed in the children's ears like a nightmare that would never end. He pulled her toward the back door, muttering under his breath, his words broken and frantic. The night outside was dark, the moon hidden behind heavy clouds. Crickets sang as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't just shifted inside that house. Ezra disappeared into the shadows with her body, leaving the children in the suffocating silence of the kitchen, their hearts pounding, their minds too young to understand, and yet too scarred to ever forget. When he returned, his shirt was stained, his hands dirty. He didn't look at the children as he passed them, didn't say a word. He poured himself another drink, his hand shaking so badly the liquor sloshed onto the floor. He sat at the table, his eyes staring into nothing, his breath shallow and uneven. The children stayed where they were, too afraid to move, too broken to cry anymore. The house that had always been a place of fear was now something worse, a graveyard of trust, a prison of secrets. And outside, hidden beneath the earth or the river's edge, their mother lay cold, her silence louder than all the screams of that night. The morning after the crime, the Coones house stood strangely quiet. The usual sounds, the shuffle of boots, the creak of the back door, the rustle of children waking, were absent. The children remained huddled together, exhausted from a night of terror, their small faces pale, their eyes swollen from crying. They had not slept. They couldn't. Every creak of the house had kept them awake. Every thought replayed the sight of their mother's body collapsing to the floor. Their father moved about with an eerie calmness that felt worse than his rage. He spoke little, only giving sharp commands: eat, wash, stay silent. His voice carried no fire, only a coldness that froze the air in the room. For Ezra, denial came quickly. He convinced himself that what happened was not murder. He told himself she had provoked him, that she had forced his hand, that it was the whiskey, not him. In his mind, he built a wall of excuses brick by brick. He muttered them under his breath, as if reciting them enough would make them true. He told the children their mother had left, that she had walked out in the night, tired of their life, tired of them. His words were unconvincing, but his glare left no room for argument. The eldest boy, though still a child, carried the truth in his eyes. He knew she hadn't left. He had seen her body dragged out into the dark, had heard the scrape of her shoes on the floor. But he also knew silence was survival. His jaw tightened whenever Ezra spoke, but he said nothing. The younger children, still clinging to a fragile hope, cried and deep begged for their mother, asking when she would return. Ezra silenced them with a heavy hand on the table, the sound making them flinch into silence. 8 days passed. The lie spread into the community. Ezra told neighbors his wife had gone to stay with her sister in another county. He said she had been unwell, restless, needing time away. Some accepted it without question. Others raised their brows, but said nothing. In a town like Ashford, people were more willing to believe a convenient story than face a truth too ugly to name. The pastor offered prayers for her well-being, and women whispered among themselves, but no one pressed too hard. Ezra's reputation, stern, proud, dangerous, was enough to keep questions at bay, but the children carried the truth like a weight they could not set down. At school, their silence grew heavier. Their laughter, already rare, vanished completely. Teachers noticed the shadows under their eyes, the way they jumped at sudden sounds. One teacher asked gently where their mother was, and the eldest boy only muttered, "She's gone," before lowering his eyes to the desk. The younger ones sometimes slipped, saying things that didn't make sense, fragments of the night spilling from their lips before fear silenced them. Their classmates looked at them strangely, but no one knew what to make of it. Inside the home, guilt began its slow work. Ezra buried himself in the fields, working until his hands bled, until the sun burned his skin raw. He drank harder at night, the liquor dulling but never erasing the images that returned when he closed his eyes. Sometimes he would wake in the dark, breathless, convinced he heard her voice calling from the edge of the house. He would stumble outside, scanning the shadows, only to find nothing. The silence mocked him. His rage turned inward, then outward again. He lashed out at the children, blaming them for her absence, blaming them for his sleepless nights. Yet in rare moments, when the bottle was low and his strength waned, he would sink into his chair, his face in his hands, whispering her name as if calling her back. Those moments were fleeting, but they revealed the cracks beneath his denial. The guilt was there, gnawing at him, no matter how he tried to cover it with anger. The community too, began to shift in its perception. At first, people accepted his story. But as weeks turned to months, questions grew. Why hadn't her sister written? Why was there no word, no letter, no visit? Women who had once offered polite smiles now exchanged wary glances. Men who had once spoken with him at the store now gave curt nods, their conversations shorter. Rumors took root. Some said she had run away. Others whispered she had died of illness. Others still suspected darker things but kept such thoughts hushed. The children bore the brunt of the whispers. They were pitted, avoided, and sometimes mocked by crueler classmates. Their mother's absence marked them, and their father's shadow followed them. The eldest boy began to harden, his eyes older than his years, his silence more defiant. The younger ones withdrew, carrying their grief in quiet sobs at night. What should have been a home became a place where loss and fear hung in every corner. The crime rippled outward in ways Ezra never expected. The farm suffered as his drinking worsened. Debts piled up, and with them, the whispers of his dealings with bootleggers grew louder. The sheriff began to take notice, though not out of concern for justice, more for the debts and trouble Ezra's actions brought into the county. The law, like the town, preferred silence when it came to family matters. But business and reputation were different. Ezra W. as no longer the man he once was in their eyes. He was a liability. For the children, the psychological toll carved itself deep. Nights were filled with nightmares, days with a hollow routine. The eldest began to dream of escape, of running from the house and never returning. But escape for a child was only a dream, one that died with the morning sun. Still, he carried the thought quietly, a seed that grew with each passing day. In time, the truth could not stay buried. A neighbor, walking near the river one late afternoon, noticed the earth disturbed in a way that seemed unnatural. Curiosity turned to suspicion, and suspicion to dread. Word spread quickly, though no one dared speak it aloud in front of Ezra. The town began watching him differently, not with respect or even simple fear, but with a wary distance, as if he carried something contagious. The crime that began in silence was now an open wound in the community. People did not confront Ezra directly, but their eyes did. In church, when he sat alone in the pew, the space around him grew wider each Sunday, families shifting further away. The children sat stiffly beside him, their small faces pale, their eyes fixed on the floor. The pastor's sermons on sin and repentance grew heavier, his gaze lingering longer on Ezra, though he never said the words outright. Ezra continued to justify, to deny, to drown himself in work and liquor. But inside, guilt festered, a sickness that no amount of pride could cure. The children carried their silence. The community carried its whispers, and the house itself seemed to carry the memory of that night in its walls. The crime had ended in a single moment of violence, but its aftermath stretched endlessly, touching everyone who had seen the Coones family and believed they were simply another household in Ashford. What once was hidden in the shadows had seeped into the very soil of the town, leaving scars that would not fade. Ezra Coones did not live forever in the shadow he had created. The lie about his wife's disappearance held for a time, but lies are like rotting wood. Eventually, they give way under the weight of truth. The disturbed earth by the river, the whispers of neighbors, the cold stares in church. It all built to a point where silence could no longer be kept. When the truth surfaced, when the body was found and the story of that night began to spill from the lips of frightened children, Ezra's world finally collapsed. The law came late, but it came. The sheriff who had once looked the other way could not ignore the evidence now lying in the open. Ezra was arrested, his wrists bound in iron, though he carried himself even then with the same pride that had marked his life. Some said he still believed he had done no wrong, that his wife's defiance, his children's disobedience, his neighbor's judgment had all left him no choice. But the courts did not see it that way. His trial was short, the testimony of his children cutting through his denials like a blade. The jury, made up of men who had once nodded to him at the general store, found him guilty. Justice, in the legal sense, was served. Ezra Coones was sentenced, and his name became a stain whispered about in Ashford for years to come. But justice is never simple. For the children, justice did not bring back their mother, nor did it erase the nights they had lived in fear. They carried scars that no gavel could heal. The eldest boy grew into a man hardened too early, his childhood lost to the weight of protecting his siblings. The younger ones grew quiet, their innocence replaced with shadows that followed them long after Ezra was gone. They bore the family name, but wanted no part of it, distancing themselves from the memory of their father and the house where it all happened. The community, too, was changed. Ashford could no longer pretend that silence was safety. For years, people had turned their eyes away, convincing themselves that what happened in another man's home was not theirs to judge. But the crime forced them to see the cost of that silence. Whispers turned into questions, and questions turned into shame. The women who had noticed bruises, the men who had seen Ezra's temper, the pastor who had prayed vague prayers, all of them were left to wonder if they had failed a woman who might still be alive if someone had spoken sooner. The town's reputation bore its own scars. Outsiders who heard the story shook their heads at Ashford's silence, at how people had allowed pride and fear to outweigh compassion and truth. For a place that prized its moral standing, the judgment stung. Slowly, the town shifted. The church sermons grew sharper about the duties of neighbors to one another. Women began speaking more openly about their burdens, though always with caution. It was not a revolution, but a crack in the old walls of silence, a recognition that what happens behind closed doors cannot always be ignored. Ezra's downfall became more than just the story of one man's violence. It became a lesson about power and control, about how pride can fester into cruelty, and how silence from others can feed the fire of abuse. He had built his life on the belief that his authority as husband, father, and provider gave him absolute control. But that belief was his undoing. The same power he clung to destroyed him, leaving behind only ruin. Morality, in the end, was not clear-cut. Some pitted Ezra, saying the war, the pressures of failing crops, and the drink had twisted him into something worse than he might have been. Others saw no excuse, only the truth of his hands around his wife's throat. His wife's memory became a quiet symbol in the community, not a loud rallying cry, but a whisper that lingered in kitchens and church pews, a reminder of what silence can cost, and of the strength it sometimes takes to speak, even when no one wants to listen. For the children, survival became the greatest act of defiance. They grew older, each carving their own path away from the shadows of Ashford. They did not forget. The memories were etched too deeply, but they learned to live despite them. Their lives bore the weight of both tragedy and resilience, proof that even in the aftermath of horror, some part of hope can remain. Looking back, the case of Ezra Coones was more than a single act of violence. It was the unraveling of a fragile world built on pride, silence, and fear. It exposed the fragility of community bonds, the dangers of unchecked power, and the devastating cost of turning away from what is uncomfortable to see. It asked hard questions about justice, whether it is found in a courtroom or in the way people learn to change after tragedy. The story leaves no heroes, only lessons. It is a reminder that evil does not always come from strangers in the night, but often from the people close. As to us, it is a reminder that silence, too, can be a kind of complicity. And it is a reminder that behind every quiet house, behind every shuttered window, there could be a story waiting to break the surface, one that carries pain, guilt, and truths we would rather not face. Ezra Coones' name faded from the headlines, but the shadow of what he did lingered in Ashford long after. The children grew, the town moved on, but the story remained. A dark chapter in the history of a place that learned too late the cost of looking away. And in that silence, broken only when it was too late, lies the deepest tragedy of all.